All right. Hey, everybody. So welcome. So today is one of our ARIAM seminars. And so we have Dr. Bradley Hastings. He's from the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership. So Dr. Bradley Hastings is Director of Executive Education at the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership. His passion is decoding leadership and utilizing these insights to equip leaders with skills to thrive in an ever-changing and more complex world. So he has 30 years of experience of working with C-suite executives in doing that. And he's going to tell us about some of the projects and the work that he does today. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Will. Thank you very much. It's good to be here. I love talking about this stuff, so I'm very excited to be here. And as Will said, decoding leadership, that's a passion of mine. And I'd like to today talk to you about some of the things that we're starting to understand about project leadership. I'm also going to talk to you about some things that we don't know yet, which are also the areas that we need to research moving forwards. But I wanted to start just with a little sort of background of the John Grill Institute, just in case you're not familiar with us. Very quickly, we have a singular unifying purpose, which is to improve project leadership. We were set up by a very generous donation by John Grill, hence the name, who noticed that in Australia in particular, when we went to do major things, we had to buy or bring in project leadership expertise from around the world. So he spotted that gap and he says, I think we can make a dent in that, and thus the John Grill Institute was founded. We do that in three different ways. We do it through transformative education, which is going to be one of my focuses, or the main focus actually, of the presentation today and the discussion today. We also do research. We research the topic of project leadership and some of the system factors that aid or hinder major projects. And we also are quite connected with industry. We have different types of dialogue with industry around some of these issues, some of these ideas, to try and, I guess, keep us honest in our research and executive education, so that we know that what we're designing and what we're researching and what we're working with is really the issues that matter for industry and government. So they kind of all work together. Sometimes I say that actually the real purpose of the Institute is actually just industry engagement. And if we're doing that correctly, research and education will flow naturally from that interaction. So my question here is, why do major projects matter? I think that's an important thing maybe to clarify. But I first wanted to ask, when you think of a major project, what comes to mind? What's top of your mind when you think of a major project? And could you call it out? Infrastructure, what type of infrastructure? New roads, yep. Cool. What else? What else comes to mind?
Western Sydney Airport.
Western Sydney Airport, yep. Yep. Unique. I'll tell you why that's unique in a moment. Yep. What else? What else comes to mind?
Social programs.
Social programs, yeah.
Yeah, like just the logistics involved with maybe like, I don't know, overhauling like particular assemblies.
Yeah, like essentially digital transformation or something like changing the way we do payments or structures or that sort of thing. Exactly, yeah. And that's a great point, because major projects are not always just infrastructure. They can be social projects. Excuse me. And they can be also digital projects. They can be really anything that is, I've got this sort of definition here. And I think, in my world and the way I think that engineering is the application of science, application of science to better lives. And I think this is interesting because this last bit here is where the major projects come in. And I know, when you guys talk about some of the robots you're building and some of the ideas that you have, I know there's some awesome ideas there, but at the end of the idea stage, there's kind of a project around bringing that idea to life in life. We've got to build the manufacturing supply chain. We've got to get the people engaged behind how to do the transformation and able to use that technology or that innovation. And that in itself is a project. And so that's where I think kind of the interweaving between the wonderful innovations and also the bringing those innovations to life is where the projects are with them. I wanted to talk very briefly about the VHS and Beta. Now, some of you might not be of my generation, so I might have to explain this one a little bit. Does anyone know what I mean when I talk about VHS and Beta? Yep. These were the things we used to do to watch movies. So you used to go to the video store, you used to rent a cassette, like a big cassette thing in a box about that big. You take it home, you plug it into your video player, you press play, and and then you had to like rewind the whole tape at the end of it, right? Because it was a tape-based thing. There were two versions. There was VHS and Betamax. So if you're a nerd like my family was, you went for Betamax because it had the best quality. But that's not the one that took off. VHS took off. Does anyone know why VHS took off? Marketing. Marketing, one reason, not the biggest reason. Cheaper? No. VHS, what do we do with videos? We watch movies. How long did Betamax tape last? About an hour and a half. Yeah. How long is a normal movie?
Yeah.
Exactly. So with VHS, you could actually just put your tape in once and watch the whole movie. With Betamax, just at the good bit, you had to go up to the machine and hit eject and put the new tape in. So unsurprisingly, which one took off? VHS took off. But to me, that is a great example of that bit that I talked about, great innovation, that the bringing it to life bit, which is the project, didn't quite go very well for Betamax because they didn't do the things that you'd expect major project leaders to do, which is to think about the end use of the product and design your system or your solution based on that end use. So they went for the quality aspect and forgot about how it was used. And that is actually not uncommon in major projects, not uncommon at all. Do you guys, so you're familiar with the ARIAM law of major projects? The ARIAM law of major project, when you think about some of these infrastructure projects, like a railway or a motorway, what sort of other things come to mind when you think about them? What other words come to mind? Think about the Sydney Metro, for example, or the light rail.
Delayed and over budget.
Delays and over budget. Yes. So the light rail was, I think, twice the budget and took twice as long. Sydney Airport, Western Sydney Airport, was actually on time and on budget. Very, very rare in the major project landscape. So the ARIAM law of major projects is that most major projects come in over time and over budget. And quite a lot of them don't actually deliver what they intended to deliver in the first place. So if you actually look at it from a price perspective, this little slither here, which you might not be able to see, are the ones that the Western Sydney airports that come in on time, on budget, and actually deliver what they said they were going to deliver. And this, I think, is a problem because if we think about this from all the money that goes in to major projects, so Australia's infrastructure pipeline, just its infrastructure pipeline, is about $1 trillion of infrastructure. And if you think about that only 0.5% of that $1 trillion is going to come in on time and on budget, that's actually a very scary thought as a taxpayer, isn't it? So this opportunity to really improve the performance of major projects is really where the John Grill Institute sits. It's to try and improve how we lead these projects. It's to try and get the Betamax to be the common solution. It's trying to get the railways built on time or the railways built at a better cost. And of course, if we can do all that, that means we can go and build new stuff, which means that bringing science to life bit, or the application of science, bringing it to life, we can do more of. And so there are many things that influence that load performance, but there's been a bunch of people around the world who've kind of studied, well, not kind of studied, they have studied, they've devoted their careers into understanding that underperformance. And the common factor that comes up time and time again is leadership, that leadership matters. So that it's the central determinant of mega project outcomes. And that basically, in a sense, that strong leadership means better governance, better outcomes. Weak leadership means cost overruns, benefit shortfalls, optimism bias, and blocking. in that sense. So we know that major project performance is poor. We know that leadership is a key differentiator. I don't know whether John Grill knew all this stuff from a research perspective when he set up the institute, but he was bang on the money in establishing our institute. So I guess the natural question from here is, right, okay, well, what's the secret sauce? What is the stuff that, the Kool-Aid that we can drink and become better leaders? I don't have that slide, okay? So I just want to be really clear. There isn't a formula for this. There isn't a E equals MC squared or something like that for leadership. It's a social social structure sort of thing. And but I am going to talk through some things we know, and I'll also talk about some things that we don't know in that sense. Here's some stuff that is kind of, I think really helpful, and I'll describe it. So if you think of a project leader, like the director of a project, and think about what it is they do, and traditionally we kind of conceptualize leadership as the leaders at the top of the organization and they lead down. Right? That's how we usually conceptualize leadership. And if the unit makes money, then the leader did a good job. And if the unit didn't make money or they didn't do anything on time, then the leadership didn't do a good job. What we find in major projects and what the research finds is that that kind of leadership isn't the problem. The reason why major projects tend to fail is because we haven't been able to lead up and navigate the political and commercial decision-making processes around the project. So we've got a bunch of, let's just say, politicians, for example, in a room, and they haven't been able to decide where the metro line stop's going to be, and they leave that to the last possible minute. And of course, when they make a decision, it's in the wrong place, and of course, that adds a whole great bit of extra cost and delay to the project. And then the second kind of common mode of failure is this idea of leading out, because in the complex environment that we operate in, if you're going to build a rail line through Sydney, you don't just start at one end and build it, right? You have to engage with communities, and you have to engage with supply chains and local supply chains and national supply chains, sometimes national supply chains. And so that aspect of aligning all the diverse stakeholders behind the project is usually also what fails. So we've got this kind of odd situation where leaders need to lead up and navigate that decision making and help those decisions happen with greater clarity and confidence. They need to lead out in order to align complex stakeholders behind the projects, including communities. And they need to lead down. And we know that these two, up and out, are where the failure modes are, but we spend 95% of all of our education training leaders to lead down and not lead up and out. And I think that's really insightful because it's an evidence-based view of kind of what we need to do and what we need to change about how we train and develop major project leaders. Does that make sense? Are there any questions on that? Well, happy to take questions as we go, by the way. So that's kind of one frame. There's some other frames to look at this. I find this one really interesting because, it's Juliana Denicol, UCL, why projects fail, decision-making, strategy, governance, risk and uncertainty, capable teams, stakeholder engagement. These are some modalities of failure. It's casting negative, I'm sorry, in terms of why major projects fail. And what Juliana did was basically, in his research, he said, well, is it the fact that we don't have technical skills or is it that we don't have other leadership skills? And essentially, skills that are sort of failing in these modalities are not technical. It's not that our project leaders don't know how to do a Gantt chart. I'm sure you're all familiar with a Gantt chart. It's not that our project leaders don't know how to do risk assessments. It's not that they don't know how to do problem-solving kind of skills. It's actually the relational stuff It's how we help groups come together to make decisions about things where the problem is, and not the individual skill sets. So I think that's also very illuminating. The other thing that we know is that major projects are becoming increasingly complex in their backdrop. And you know that this is a study, again, by Giuliano and colleagues in the Brazil Defense Force. And what it's saying is that if you look at each of these elements here of how a project is meant to work, and you said, oh, okay, I'll fix that, I'll make it better. Well, yes, you can. But what it's saying is that if you fix this one up here, also, by fixing that, you're going to influence something down here. And by fixing that, you're going to influence something over here. By fixing that, you're going to influence something up there and also over there. And what that means is that the major project systems that we operate in are interrelated. And it's a little bit like trying to balance a marble on a plate. You ever try to do that? You kind of get it into one spot for a second and then it moves and then you've got to adjust it. But because you've actually adjusted it, you've actually kicked it in a direction that you didn't want to go. So you're kind of chasing it all the time in this kind of dynamic movement. They say that flying helicopters is the same. You're always making adjustments. You're always trying to find a new balance in the system. And that's another thing that we know about major projects is they're very, very, very complex. So for me, what do I think this means? Well, I think that this means that when we think about major project leadership, we really have to step out of this idea that we're using linear reductionist thinking in order to lead these projects. And we need to get out of that box or that bubble. It's a box here, maybe it's a bubble, and actually sort of embrace that the world and major projects don't really act like that. A bit like that circle diagram that I mentioned. Fix one thing, fix it, the change of something else, you have to change that. You've got this constant kind of battle of trying to find the levers that are actually going to drive your performance. And so that is quite profound because in major project sort of world, the majority of our teaching of how we teach people how to do projects is actually based on the idea that we can reduce a major project into a single Gantt chart, and we can start at the top of the Gantt chart and work our way through it and end up with the outcome. And what we're learning is that's great for organizing, but that's not how you lead major projects. I've had the pleasure of spending a lot of time in CEOs' offices in the last few months trying to sell some of our executive education programs. I've had the opportunity to listen to them, and this is what they say. They say that we need to embrace the complexity. We need leaders who can embrace the complexity. We need leaders who can use AI to embrace the complexity. We need leaders who can lead better in uncertainty. And we need leaders that are all relational. And for me, that's quite confirmatory because what these CEOs are saying is kind of backed up by the research journey that I've just articulated. Okay, so I haven't told you what the secret sauce is yet. Right? We're not much closer. We've got an idea of what the backdrop is, but how do we have a hope of developing leaders towards being able to lead in these complex, uncertain, unpredictable, rapid, tangled environments that are major projects. I kind of want to tell you a story that kind of adds a little bit of weight to this idea that the traditional way of thinking about major projects doesn't work. Anyway, and it's a story about a photocopier. This is Xerox, and this is actually back in the 80s, so it's a little bit of time ago. And Xerox said, look, we're spending a huge amount of our time and energy on fixing photocopiers. We have this sort of mobile team of repair people that go around and fix photocopiers. Can't we do something about that? Can't we make it easier and simple to fix a photocopier? And you would think, right, that their approach, which was to try and codify and project flow all the things that could go wrong with a photocopier, so you could kind of give it to any numpty like me, and they could fix the photocopier. You'd think that would be possible, right, in today's kind of our ability to decode things, write it down, get process flows, that sort of thing. Except it wasn't. They couldn't do it. They put all the resources into this to try and codify it, to try and put the processes behind it. And what they found is that with all of those project teams, they couldn't map out all the different failure modes for one photocopier. They couldn't do it. It was too complex. By the time they kind of got there, more failure modes opened up. More ways that this could go wrong opened up. And they were just chasing their tail, and they had to give up. What they noticed in that research is that the repair people didn't use the manuals that Xerox had created. The repair people did something different. And this is back before the time of WhatsApp groups and mobile phones and things like that. The repair people used to meet for coffee at certain cafes. And that they would go to these cafes and they'd sort of chat about what failure modes they were seeing and how to fix them. So they were kind of like, oh, what have you seen today, Bob? Oh, I saw the jam in the A section. That's interesting. How'd you fix it? And that this kind of cafe network became a way of the repair people sharing knowledge with each other, totally self-organized by the repair people. But it became a way of them actually being able to radically improve the efficiency of how they fix photocopies. So you might say, what does a photocopier have to do with major projects? Well, I think it has a lot to do with major projects. Because if we can't use linear, reductionist, process flows, Gantt charts to fix a photocopier, what hope do we have of using those same tools to fix a major project? I think it's pretty good. So what this introduces, what this example introduces, is actually kind of like a foundational shift in how we think about things like fixing photocopies. How do we conceptualize that? How do we work together? And the general sort of approach that we have is that there's kind of two modes of thinking and making sense about these types of things. There's a modality that comes from knowing. This idea that we have prior knowledge that we can draw on, and we use that prior knowledge to fix the problem. This kind of expert thinking, that if I've seen this before, I can kind of know, I know what to do in this environment. It's knowledge. That's not what those photocopier repair teams were doing. They weren't using, that's what Xerox were trying to do. They were trying to actually codify all the knowledge into a manual and then using it. It didn't quite work for a photocopier. So what was actually happening? What was actually happening was that the repair people were getting together and they were sense making. So rather than using their kind of repository of knowledge or information to fix the problems, they were actually engaging in what we call sense making, which is a dynamic and ongoing mode of inquiry. It's a conversation. It's saying, hey, Bob, what did you see yesterday and what can we learn from it? What are you noticing about what's happening with these failure modes and how do we make sense of that? And that in that process of sense making, we're actually giving meaning to different contexts. We're giving meaning to different failure modes by saying, hey, Bob, when you have a paper jam in mode A, maybe this is the way, this is the nudge that you need to give it in order to fix it in that sense. And that's a very different process because it's a co-creation process. It comes from dialogue. And the dialogue is dynamic and it's interactive and it relates to the context. It's not a process of saying, this is the failure mode, this is the answer. It's a way of thinking of saying, let's explore this, let's dive into it, let's bring meaning to it, and once we've done, we can use that meaning in order to move forward. That shift has a profound impact on leadership. That shift from knowing to sense making is what leadership scholars around the world have identified as being probably the highest correlation with difference in leadership outcomes. I'll explain a little bit about what that means. What adult development psychologists have actually done is they've been able to codify some of those modalities of how we think and how we make meaning and interact with the world. And they've developed a journey. And it starts on the left as self-protective, and that's kind of like your baby, how they start to think about themselves. So you try and take an ice cream from a baby, right? They don't like that, right? I think also there might be some politicians that might be down that end of the spectrum as well, potentially. Might name a couple. And on the right-hand side of the spectrum are like your philosophers, like your David Attenboroughs, like the people who are sitting back and thinking about some of the undercurrents in our modern-day world and nudging and working those. And they've developed a journey. Generally, we come out of self-protective in our late sort of single-digit years. We go into diplomat. We start to work, start to change from that self-protective mechanism to diplomat is about belonging. This is about the groups that we form when we're in our teenage years, where we are governed essentially by a desire to belong to the group, which means that we'll kind of do all the stuff that the group does. If that means graffitiing trains, then I'll do it because that's what my mates are doing, right? So, etc., etc. What tends to happen in late teens is that people come out of that diplomat phase a little bit and they start to develop a craft, they start to develop a skill, they start to train to be a doctor, they start to train to be an engineer. And suddenly their way of interacting and thinking about the world changes as well. They're a little bit less concerned with belonging, but they're more developing their self-identity based on the craft that they have. And by basing my self-identity on that craft, I'm also embracing some other ways of thinking. So experts, for example, think a little bit more about what's right, what's wrong. That's a quite very big modality for experts. You know, I know the right way to do this, or I can find out the right way to do this. And there is that one single right way to do this. So achievers step out of expert and they start to think a little bit less about what's right and wrong, and they start to think about more about what's right for the system, what's best for the system, so not what's right, what's best. Achievers are the people who lead teams, who are able to think a little bit beyond what the expertise is, and they're able to think about goals and outcomes at a collective level, and they start to get their value and self-worth from achievement of goals. And it goes on, redefining, start to ask, why on earth am I starting to do I think like this? And it's the transforming mindset, which is a systems thinking kind of mindset, which is where the magic of leadership is. And what we know is that as this journey progresses, there's kind of a line in the middle, around about that achiever perspective, where beyond it, we have a really high correlation with project leadership success. Really high correlation. Because in this transforming mindset and in the redefining mindsets, how people make sense of the world is a little bit different. They stop looking at what's happening at face value. They're not too concerned about what's right and wrong. Well, they are in the sense that they want to understand what's right and wrong, but that doesn't govern essentially what they do, because what they're doing is they're starting to look underneath the surface of what's happening in everyday life and looking at the undercurrents, the patterns, and working at that level in order to create change, transformation. These are the people who are values-driven, they're purpose-driven, and they're able to look at situations and kind of like say something which makes you go, yeah, that's why we're here. Yeah, and that brings clarity to what I need to do next. If you imagine kind of like a meeting, and underneath the table there's cogs and wheels, transforming people work at the cogs and wheels kind of level. And we know that's what we need for project leadership success. The problem is that 85% of leaders, particularly engineers, sit at the left-hand side of that. And also 95% of executive education is focused on the left-hand side. So let me just dive into that a little bit more. And I'm going to talk about the difference between an expert and a transforming mindset. Experts value, as I said, expertise. They think about power in terms of knowledge. Knowledge brings power. If I have knowledge, I have power in this room. Whereas transformers think about power as something that we co-create, something that is an outcome of people coming together, and that collaboration is power in terms of moving forwards. Experts, I love this one, generally do conflict as a failure. I haven't done my job right if there's conflict. Whereas transforming people see conflict as inevitable and they navigate it. In that sense. What are strengths? Experts are important, that we need efficiency, precise work. Whereas transforming people think about, well, actually, I'm thinking about not what's right or wrong now, but I'm thinking about the future of where we need to be and how we can navigate towards that journey. Do you have any questions on that? Is it a linear progression or is it a leapfrog kind of thing? Great question. It's both. So some people naturally get to transforming really quickly. We don't know why. We have no idea why. What we know is that most, and there is some leapfrogging at times. So it isn't a completely linear pathway, yet we know that most people go through it in a linear fashion. And I don't know whether that's to do with the way that we educate people, because essentially our education system is designed to create experts. That's how it works. So we're bringing people in school to become experts in a craft and a way of doing things. So the problem is that not everyone gets to transform. So most people stop. I want stop here and I want stop there. And one of the problems that we have in leadership is we tend to promote the best experts into leadership roles. So we say, well, you're the best engineer, we'll put you in a job to lead the other engineers. Okay, completely different job, leadership, but because you're the best engineer, we're going to put you in that role and assume you can do it. And actually, that's a very, very difficult situation for the team because the skills that we need to be an expert are not the skills that we need to be a leader. So the challenge is really to try and shift more up this curve. Does that answer your question? Any other questions?
Yeah, Bradley, it's Stephen Williams. I'm just online. Apologies, couldn't be there today. One question I had, that sort of evolving project leadership graph that you have, what happens in situations where you end up with kind of leadership that is very much on the left-hand side, that kind of self-protective, that can cause, or I guess create an environment that's not very supportive of innovation and development? Are there ways that organizations can work around or minimize the impact of that kind of that as a challenge?
Great question. Thanks, Stefan. So if we go back to this slide, and the question was, if there are leaders over here, how does that affect things like innovation? And can organizations get around that? There isn't a single answer to that. So from experience and what we know is that leaders on the left-hand side of the line generally lead organizations which are not innovative, and they generally lead projects and organizations where they're constantly trying to fit the future into an understanding of the past, or they're constantly behaving in ways where their leading is governed by, for example, their diplomat, which means they're just trying to get you to like them as a leader rather than making the tough decisions. So that's how those modalities play out. In the innovation sense, generally those environments are not conducive to innovation at all from a leadership perspective. But the other factor around innovation is also structural. So there are other ways of creating innovation. For example, and universities, I think, do this well. We give researchers autonomy over their research project, and therefore, within that project, we're not telling them what to do day in, day out. So there is a space for innovation. So I think in answer to your question, no, those leadership factors on the left are not conducive to innovation. However, there is another dimension to innovation that we know about, which is creating space for innovation. So if you think about like, you know, a big organization like Lockheed Martin who have their skunk works, where they just created a space, put some engineers in and said, look, you guys are free of bureaucracy, make something really, really cool. But that is what I mean about creating space for innovation, which is also a very big lever on innovation in that sense. So I think the short answer is yes and no. Does that help, Stefan?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's great.
Other questions?
Yeah, I guess the thing I had is in like just kind of like a well-rounded functioning organization, how important is it that everyone, like at all the different levels of like work taking place, kind of moves up this scale of self-protected transforming? Or is it sort of like it's okay if like a bunch of people who are doing like all of the busy work on the ground, it's fine for them to kind of like get expert sort of cruise along there because they're not really in a position where they're being asked to have a transformative thinking. Like what extent is important for everyone to go through this progression in an organization?
In my humble view, you absolutely do not want everyone to go through this journey, because then you'll end up with a bunch of philosophers who'll sit around the room and not do anything. So it is about creating that balance. And I think the thing that we know from a leadership perspective that's important here, we know that experts are important. We need the person who's going to dive into the data and go, this is the right thing to do. We need them in a team. We absolutely need them. It's actually sometimes okay to have a self-protective person in a team because they can actually shift dialogue. You know, they can actually bring something to the table. They go, no, this is mine and you're not having it. And actually I know that sounds very self-protective, but actually that can also be helpful for organizations. You know, there is a reason why narcissistic leaders actually do have impact. So we know that narcissistic leaders actually do have impact. So there are some reasons behind that. So I'm not saying that's what we want to that's what I want to create. And if I go back to the narcissistic leaders, they tend to have impact in the short term, but not the long term. In that sense. So I want to be clear that what I'm not saying is that everything on the left is wrong. What I am saying is that leaders on the left in the data that we have is not the best way to lead in complex environments. And so that means that you do want the leaders over to the right, but you also want to be leading a team where you have the experts, coaches and diplomats, achievers in that team, and be cognizant. And when we teach this stuff to executives, we're cognizant of the mix and the balance in that team and how it's coming together. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's
Other questions? So that's the difference between expert and transforming. Transforming leaders tend to think in slightly different ways. This is another point of convergence in the literature where leadership science, adult development theory, and also project leadership science come together in describing what we want out of the future generation of leaders. We want them to think at a systems level. We want them to think about nudging systems. We want them to think about inquiry-based experimentation, which is, this is uncertain, so how do I decode uncertainty? I inquire into it, and then I'm able to experiment with different things and find out what works and what doesn't. Embracing diversity and difference as a source of thriving. Playful agility, so thinking about how we think about issues and playing with that in a live environment. You know, I think about it this way. How do you think about it? Oh, interesting. Oh, that's a bit different to how I think about it. Or maybe I should adjust my thinking. It's that kind of updating of how we think. Positive use of language. I think that's probably self-explanatory. Passionate attachment. This idea that actually I can be engaged in this conversation quite fully, but detached from whether it's actually impacting me. So if there's something that's not going well, I'm not taking that as a slight on myself. I'm actually, okay, that's just part of the conversation. It's something that I can detach myself from the emotions while being connected in terms of the conversation and the learnings that come from it. The courageous use of power, so the ability to actually think about power dynamics in conversations and power dynamics in organizations and being able to play with those power dynamics. I also talked a little bit earlier about how leaders relate, and we tend to talk about relating with ourselves a lot. We tend to talk in executive education around relating to teams. We talk a little bit less about how we relate across systems. And it's that third thing which actually has also quite a lot of power in major projects, because if you remember from the beginning, leading up and also leading out. So creating an alignment between different stakeholders in a project system is actually incredibly important for project success. Okay, so bringing this together, what we know from science is that, and we call this vertical and horizontal development. So developing the mindsets or the ways of thinking towards transforming and developing relational leaders that think at more system level is actually correlated with increasing effectiveness. So we know that. And from a executive ed perspective, excuse me, you might say to me, well, does this stuff work? Well, actually, we know when we've done prior versions of our executive education framed around this way of educating project leaders, that they go on and do great things. They go and save a couple $100 million on a project. They go and get projects which weren't working and sort of cremated almost, and they bring them back to life. They're able to create alignment where there was nothing. They're able to get multi-billion-dollar projects back on track. And we also know, and this is just a snapshot, we do this work. When I say we, the team do this work where they track, Natalie does this for tracking job titles pre and post some of our executive education. And I think we've created about 5 or 6 chief executives, and generally a large shift up in terms of project leader to project director, regional director, or portfolio director of projects. So we think this stuff works. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about it. I wanted to wrap up with a little bit of a summary of what's next for us as an institute. What we see moving forwards is that there are 2 opportunities to work and to decode leadership. One is in the actual leadership from an individual perspective, and continuing to build on what we know into nailing down the modalities of leading in uncertainty and complexity. How to lead with AI, that's a really big question. What is AI? How is it a team? How do we think about AI as a team member? How do we understand the limitations of AI? How do we know how we need to be around AI? Another big question. How to build collaborations, but also the other stream over here, and how we think about project ecosystems and how we think about the ways in which we conceive and set up projects in that political, in that governance landscape, in that financial landscape, and what are some of the system factors which are aiding or hindering the way that major projects unfold. And so we see a huge amount of research in that. And what that means for us is, more research on leadership capabilities, more executive education programs, a lot of translational research. I'm not an academic traditionally. I spent 20 years in industry. When I came to academia, I thought, great, I'm going to be bringing all this knowledge of how to help organizations transform to academia. I got here and I was like, it's already there. It was just written in academic papers that were hidden behind paywalls, which I didn't have any sight on beforehand. So I think there's a huge opportunity for us, the Institute, to be translating that research, stuff that we know about, the stuff that we're talking about here, into practical and relevant insights for industry and government. That's it from me. I think it's 10 minutes to go. Thank you again for your time, and happy to take any more questions that you have. Yes. Cool.
So, when you talk about leading up, and it strikes me that a lot of like leading up involves kind of education, right? Like educating the people above you what is valuable. Are there actually ways to measure that kind of learning and measure the impact of these things?
How to measure the impact of leading up.
Yeah, or measure learning.
That's true. I guess there's two parts to that in my mind, is the learning and the outcome. We can certainly measure the outcomes because a project might get back on track, or it might save some money, or it might get done quickly. How do we measure the learning? Need to think about that one. Yeah.
So, like, I guess I was thinking of in things like, if you're going to build some new piece of infrastructure or whatever, often projects get commissioned to do some nice analytics or whatever. But I think in a lot of these projects, well, either the decision is made beforehand and they're looking to kind of do the study to justify the decision that they've already made. And, maybe the study shows the decision they've already made and then nobody complains. So we don't know if it made any impact in that case. But in other cases, these things get done and then they get ignored. And there's a million reasons why you can dismiss any kind of analytic study because it's almost by definition like a simplification of the problem. But kind of as you started with, a lot of the reason I think those things do sometimes get dismissed is because it lacks the kind of soft engagement that's required throughout that project. And that would be learning effectively throughout. So yeah, I wondered if there is actually any literature that assesses the impact or tries to assess.
There's a whole bunch of literature on learning organizations and how to create feedback loops in organizations, which might be helpful there. I think let me tell you a story. So I worked with this organization in Europe that they were making paint. Sounds very boring. They had 6 manufacturing sites across Europe, and they decided they had a board level project to reduce costs by centralizing their 6 manufacturing sites into one site in the middle of Europe. And it was going to save like 15 million a year. It was going to cost them like 40 million to do, or something like that. And it was all predicated on this idea that the service levels to customers were already high, and that, yes, it would be an impact to service because you're distributing further, like more along the way. But, and they're about to push the button on this project. And we went in to have a look at it. And it turned out really quickly that actually their service levels were not high. They thought they were running at 99% service level. Actually, when we calculated, they were running about 23% service level. Now, with that information, how do you shift a board that have already committed to a 40 million investment? Well, you have to reframe their thinking. You have to give them something that is going to help them adjust their thinking on service levels. So how do we do that? Well, we've got them out of the board and we said, right, all you guys need to do is to spend an hour with a customer service agent listening to what our customers are doing when they're calling up. And they're screaming about this really poor service level. So we did that. We got the board, we got the chief executive, we got the finance director, we got the marketing director, particularly the marketing director, because he was the one who's saying we've got all this great service. They actually didn't spend 2 hours in the contact center. They spent about 15 minutes in the contact center, and their minds blew up. And it was a radical shift in their thinking. And they went from, we're going to spend 40 million on this plan to, like, it was the quickest abandonment of a business plan I've ever seen. It didn't exist after that. It was like, oh, what plan? What plan? Fine, but they moved on. And so these things are the kind of moments that we need to create when we're leading up. Now, I don't know. And so what the leadership aspect of that is going, well, there's 2 ways I could approach that problem. I could stand up there and do a scientific presentation on why their service levels are not very good, to which point they're probably just going to argue with. or I could create an experience that they can go through, which is going to transform how they think. And so I took the second option. I've got no idea whether the first option would have worked. My sense is it wouldn't have, because they needed that experiential thing. And that's what leading up. It's how do we create a way, a system, an experience, an understanding that shifts narrative. People who lead up in politics, like in major projects, they do it through the press. And you see all these little leaks about the performance of a project or something that they're not considering. You know, people lobby the press and they're getting this story out there. And what's the best way to get a politician to change their mind? I'm not a very nice news story about them. You know? So this is how we as project leaders and engineers need to think out of the box of just presenting the facts to how do we create the experiences that can shift how people think about this.
So just looking at what's happening in the market in Australia at the moment, that Telstra's looking at offshoring stuff.
Yeah.
So if you look at their business plan and what they did, what they've done strategically to think that is, well, obviously it's money driven.
Yeah.
Is that a key driver for such a big group that has had Optus do all sorts of ridiculous things in the last months?
I don't know. The question, if you're online, is about Telstra specific to offshore lots of staff. So I don't know whether that's a good or bad decision. I know that you know, if I was trying to stop them from doing that, I would try and think of things that are important to the board which might come up as risks. So I might think about cybersecurity, or I might think about quality of service or something like that, and try and maybe, I don't know, borrowing on the first example, create an experience where I get the board, done this before, get the board to ring their own customer service line and see what it's like. Yeah. So and that might be a way of doing that. I used to do that in the UK in government services. I get the council executives and the politicians to ring the service line, and they'd be on hold for 30 minutes. So it's like, well, how was that experience for you? Yeah, okay, I didn't like it. Oh, should we spend more on customer service? Yes, we should. Okay, so there's just this sort of, you know, and I don't know the Telstra thing. Maybe they're doing the right thing. I actually have no idea. But these are the things that, you know, from a leadership perspective, it's getting out of that box of just what's right and wrong and starting to think about, you know, why do humans make decisions? Why do we come to that decision? Most of the decisions we come to are actually because our peer group came to those decisions, not because we came to those decisions. So they're actually, in many regards, pretty new. So, you know, when my partner and I go on holidays, the first question we ask, we don't go onto Google and do some objective assessment of like where we're going to go. We ask someone who's been there before where they went, and we end up doing the same thing. This idea that actually that person had the optimum route through India, it's completely bonkers when you think about it. But yeah, that's what we do. So yeah. Other questions?
Oh, thank the speaker again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think just hearing that CEO's done something